So I got all my parts in to rebuild the top end of my motorized bike. If you've seen my other video, I rode 1,800 miles and then the rings gave away and kind of messed up the piston in the jug. So I got a new jug, a new piston. The bottom end is all stock, the original stuff. So anyway, what I noticed when I was kind of mock fitting this all together is that at top dead center, which we're at right now on the engine, you can see in there a good portion, a solid 1/5 of the intake port is blocked off by the piston. And I know that I have it correct because your little arrow here needs to point towards the front of your engine, or if you have your engine some funny orientation, this arrow needs to point at your exhaust port, which is this side over here. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and mark that, and I'm going to go ahead and grind it off so I get better intake, a better intake area there, because you can see that blocks off some of the intake flow. And I got my gasket on here, my old one that's already pre-crushed, so I know that everything's where it should be, and this is at the very top of its dwell, this piston here. So we'll go ahead and make a mark and then pull that all apart so you can get a look at that. And I'm going to go ahead and grind it off. I wanted to make a note here that whenever you disassemble, usually this wrist pin is in here a little tight, so what you want to do is, if you plan to reuse your piston, is to put a rag in here in between your head studs and your piston, but still allow area to punch that wrist pin through so that you don't damage your piston on these head studs. So I went ahead and knocked it through just like that, so it should be as simple as grab it from the other end and then she's all apart. Okay, so as you can see, I marked off here where the piston was covering the intake port, and considering how big that intake port is, which is only yay big, you know, that's a decent amount when you got a piston turning at 5,000 RPM, so that's pretty fast, and that limits some of the flow. So before I reinstall this, I'm going to go ahead and grind it out. So, and this will definitely be a problem if you have anything that's a bigger spaced gasket here below the jug. You'll have to grind more out, so that should help performance a little. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll check back. Okay, so we're getting ready to put the motorized bike back together now and rebuild the top end. So I got a new jug, new piston, new rings, new wrist pin bearing and wrist pin, and E-clips. I went ahead and cleaned all the carbon out of the top of my head, so we should be good to go here. First thing you want to do is make sure all your gasket mating surfaces are clean. I went around this one with carb cleaner, so you want to make sure that there's no oil or any residue of that nature on that surface so that everything will seal up real good. So, and you want to always use new gaskets. So I'm going to go ahead and slide that on, and then we'll go on to inserting the piston. Quick note here to make is I had to cut out along this edge of the gasket so it didn't obstruct the flow on the intake port from the crankcase to the jug. So again, we'll go ahead and get the piston on here. Okay, so we got everything hooked in there, and how it goes is you take your wrist pin bearing, set it in your rod, and then you set your piston over it and push your wrist pin through, and then you take your little clips here with needle nose pliers, and you'll squeeze them and put them in and turn them in, and they'll pop in. They have a seat, so you know when they're in. You want to rotate them, make sure they're into their seat, And again, you want to make sure this arrow is pointing towards the front of the bike, or if you don't have it on a bike, towards your exhaust port, which is over here. So that's opposite of the side that your carburetor's on. So anyway, and you want to make sure you have a rag down here so that you don't drop anything into the crankcase like these little clips, because that's real easy to do. And then pretty much you're ready to set on your jug. I make sure I give everything a good oil bath before I insert it, so those the bearing and the connecting, or the bearing and the wrist pin, excuse me, I had them good and oiled up before I slipped them in there, because it's just good practice. I also have a relief that I did in the back of my piston with a file, so that at top dead center it doesn't partially cover up my intake port here, so that'll be good. So we'll go ahead and slide the jug on here, and I'm going to oil up the cylinder wall so it slides on easier. And you can just compress these rings with your fingers when you slide it on. Something to look out for is these rings actually have a seat, and they're actually both on the other side. It's like a little pin that comes through, and oh, there's one right here. So it's a little pin that comes through, and that's right where the you can kind of see the pin, and that's where the ring's supposed to meet. And so, because these rings aren't supposed to rotate, because they can get caught on the cylinder ports here. So I'm going to go ahead and compress these rings with my fingers and slide the jug on. Obviously, you'd compress the top ring, get it slid over, and then you compress the lower ring and slide it over. So again, I'm going to go ahead and oil that up so it makes the process a lot easier and doesn't damage anything. So here we go. I also wanted to mention that it makes everything a lot easier to bring your connecting rod to top dead center before you start trying to install everything. And I removed this cover here so I could just turn this and put it to top dead center, and then let out my clutch, so the wheel is holding it in place, so it shouldn't go anywhere. So again, that makes things really easy to install and assemble, and especially when you go to slide this jug on. And just like that, it slides on. So again, I compressed the top ring first, slid the jug on over the top ring, and then compressed the second ring and slid it the rest of the way. So it's a little tricky and a little difficult, and you want to make sure you get that the opening right where that pin is. You don't want to get anything binding up. So after you get it on, thought it'd be practice to grab down here, let out your clutch, and see if it'll turn. So mine turns pretty good, and you can feel the friction in the rings. So when it runs, they'll seat, and they're just iron rings, so they should seat pretty fast. I'll turn it over here, bring it to top dead center. Oop, a little bit past. Right there is pretty close. You can see now that when we look in here, after that's been cut out, that part of the piston doesn't show. So you can see there it is, and then, oops, and get it to rotate, and there's top dead center. So you can see that would be covering the intake port. So I went ahead and ground that out. I marked it with a Sharpie and then cut it out. So anyway, we'll go ahead and install the rest of everything. From here it's pretty simple, just slap on and go. So the next step is to install the head, and what I do is I put a little oil on the threads of the head studs so that when I torque down my bolts I get an accurate torque spec. I've been kind of lazy and I keep forgetting to change these or pick up different ones at the hardware store, but I recommend getting some different nuts instead of these Acorn nuts. They're not as good. You don't want anything that's a locking nut, because then you can't accurately torque it. And so, and the torque spec on these head studs is 12 foot-pounds, I believe, so not a whole lot. And you want to go in a crisscross pattern. You want to do it usually in a 3-step process. So you go like, I don't know, 4, 8, 12 maybe. So you do all of them to 4, then all of them to 8, and all of them to 12, and that prevents head warpage. So you do that on any type of head that you're torquing. So anyway, once you're at this point, now it's just attach your carburetor and your muffler, and you're good to go. So seems like it's doing its job. Nothing's binding up, and that piston isn't covering up that port. So that's good. There we go. You can see that it clears. So that's something to look into. But anyhow, so I'm going to go ahead and reassemble the rest of it, but overall the top end is a pretty easy job. Alright, and just like that, you're reassembled and you're ready to rock and roll again. You always want to use a new intake and exhaust gasket, but if you don't and you reuse it, the exhaust gasket will usually be fine, but the intake gasket will usually benefit from a very light coat of gasket sealer. So that helps to keep it all sealed up after it's been compressed once. And then on my cover here, where the CDI or whatever it's called, the coil is at, or the magneto, there we go. You always want to make sure to have that good and sealed up, because if any water gets in there, it'll kill these motorized bike magnetos right off. So I took my gasket off, and always you want to wipe it all down from all oil and grease so your gasket sealer will work. And I put a light coating on both sides of the gasket and put her back on there. So that should keep that good and sealed up from any rainwater that I may go through. So anyway, there you have it. We'll go ahead and go fire up, but that's how you pretty much rebuild your top end. It's real simple. Anyone can do it.